What Satan meant for evil, God meant for good, right? He is the great repurposer, the restorer, the redeemer that can take something that Satan maybe used to destroy you, and he can use it instead to strengthen and develop you. That's the message of hope in my mind for every man out there listening, because we recognize then this: hope is never lost, because hope is a person and hope has a name, and that name is Jesus.
Men's Alliance is tribes across the nation that meet weekly for rugged outdoor workouts and real-world devotions around a fire. We are changing what Christian men's ministry in this country looks like. And when you're ready to challenge yourself physically and spiritually, join us at men'salliancetribe.com. Hey guys, welcome to the Men's Alliance podcast. I'm here today with Zach Clinton. Really excited. Zach is such a busy guy. We finally got him on the podcast, and I'm thrilled. For those of you that aren't familiar with his ministry and who he is, we're going to get all into that today. But Zach is a counselor. He's a speaker. He's an author. And he's also the vice president of American Association of Christian Counselors. So busy guy. Welcome, Zach, to the Men's Alliance podcast.
David, my friend, thank you so much for having me on. I love all the incredible things you guys are doing in and through Men's Alliance. We love partnering in and through it with you guys at Ignite. You guys are a blessing, so thank you for your time and having me on, my friend.
Yeah, man. So in his podcast, by the way, of all the intro pieces and hats that he wears, his podcast is called the Built Different Podcast. Guys, if you're listening to this and you haven't ever heard of that, go check that one out. He has lots of amazing guests on there and amazing messages that are just perfectly in line with everything we talk about in Men's Alliance. It's all about helping men become the best versions of themselves that God built us to be. So I'm especially biased towards episode 177.
Come on.
Thanks for having us on your podcast, bro. But the Built Different podcast is one of your ministries. And of course, we first connected over the Ignite conference, which is a part of your ministry. Yes. And I want to hear about all these different things, Built Different, Ignite. Start us off with a little bit. Tell us about your book, Even If.
Absolutely, my friend. Can't wait to dive into all of these things and these endeavors that God has really placed on all of our hearts here at leadership at AACC and Ignite and Built Different. But when it starts with even if, David, this message really sparked out of a place of, darkness and discouragement in my own personal life. I was going through a stormy season of life, and I was reminded of the words out of Daniel chapter 3. It was a very unique account and story in scripture that I always was drawn to as a kid. As a boy growing up, my dad would always remind me of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I just thought it was so fitting for the season of life that I found myself in. And I think it's very fitting for the season of culture and society that we find ourselves in. The story goes back to King Nebuchadnezzar was the king over the empire of Babylon. That was the biggest, baddest, entire kingdom back in those days. And he decided one day that he was going to make this massive golden statue, or this pillar that was 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. And everyone upon the sound of music was going to bow down and worship it. And so everybody did, right? Everybody went with the way. They compromised to the way of culture, to their circumstances, except for 3 men that said, no, we're not compromising, but we're going to conform to the image of Christ. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they decided to stand. They didn't bow to anything but their God. And King Nebuchadnezzar caught wind. I always joke around saying it was probably from his, King Nebuchadnezzar brown-nosing fan club. And they brought him and they said, hey, there's 3 dudes that aren't obeying your decrees. So King Nebuchadnezzar calls them into his presence. He says, hey, guys, is it true? Is it true that when the sound of music's playing that you're the only 3 standing? I'll give you one more shot. We're going to play the sound of music. If you decide to bow down and worship my gods in the image I put up before you, very well. But if you don't, then there's a burning hot fiery furnace that's waiting to take your lives, pretty much is what he's saying. And I love how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego decided to respond. They said, you know what, King, you don't even have the right really to approach us about this matter. In other words, we've already made up our minds. And then they offer us this beautiful 3-tiered prayer. Not only do we believe that our God is able, but we also believe that he will deliver us from your majesty's hands, right? So they give us this sense of confidence, this faith of assurance. But then they followed up with two very transformative words, the title of the book. But even if he does not, we still will not bow down and worship your gods or the image of gold you've set up before us. The beautiful thing about those words, and I try to depict within the book, is that there's a big difference between what if, only if, and even if, right? A lot of people live what if lives, allowing the fear of what if to make them settle for what is. In our mental health space, we call that analysis paralysis. So afraid of what could happen tomorrow that they're, in a sense, crippled and they can't do anything productive today. Then there's that only if space, right? A lot of men live in that only if space, I think, where it's like, I'll do it only if it's comfortable and if it's convenient, right? I'll do it based on my preferences, based on, rather than, I should say, God's principles and promises. And so a lot of people live in that only if space as well, result driven. That leads to a contingent faith. The what if leads to a complacent faith. I don't want either of those things. I know you don't either, David. But then there's the even if mindset, right? People that say, even if it hurts, even if it's hard, even if it's the road less traveled, even if nobody else is doing it, even if I don't get out of life what I was hoping, expecting, praying, or preparing to get out of it, I'm going to stay true to my faith, to my family, to my friends, and to the standard within me, rather than succumbing to the expectations, opinions, or circumstances around me. Why? Because God cares so much more about our character than he does about our comfort. And that was the message that really was sparked behind this even if mindset, developing into kids, developing into men, and just building a culture of high character, high quality individuals, again, that aren't conforming to the ways and the patterns of culture or their circumstances, but instead are choosing to conform to the image of Christ.
Wow, man, there's so much awesomeness in what you just said. I like the line in there. God cares more about our character than our comfort.
Yeah.
That's a big part of our MA messaging. And I think it's just absolutely incredible that you titled your book this, because that's such a story that's so near and dear to my heart. And when we've talked about it a lot on the MA podcast here, you're probably familiar with the Battle of Dunkirk.
Yeah.
And are you familiar with the use of that same phrase there?
Yep.
This is one of my favorite, little vignettes from military history. The Brits, they are pushed to the water by the Nazis. They're completely surrounded. They're completely cut off. And they have requested rescue across the English Channel from Britain. And they are all too aware that there might not be a rescue. They've asked to be rescued, but they know that there might not be the availability of enough ships to come pick them all up. And they're facing total annihilation from the Nazis. And the officer in charge of the British forces at Dunkirk, he sent a 3-word telegram back to his commander, and it just said, "But if not." And that was that's like the King James version of the even if, right? That's the King James version. And there's a lot of great lessons from that 3-word telegraph that he sent. One of them is, if that message were sent today, nobody would get it.
That's right.
Like the biblical knowledge, biblical intelligence has dropped. But in the 1940s, everybody got the reference instantly. It was the reference that you just explained about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And everybody knew that he was saying, even if you're not able to come rescue me, I'm still good. I'm fine. I'm going to hold out. I'm not upset. I'm not here wringing my hands. I'm doing what I'm here to do. And, in the world of counseling, I always refer to this as outcome independence.
Yes.
Like, you're going to be okay regardless of the outcome of this situation. Don't hang your well-being on getting a specific desired outcome. You've got to be independent of whatever outcome you're in. And I think about that a lot when we pray as Christians too. It's like, man, pray big prayers, pray bold prayers, pray specific prayers, but don't hinge your faith on getting those to where that if you don't get those things you asked for, you just crumble. You've got to always have that even if that but if not mentality of I'm going to serve God even if I don't
That's
get
it.
what I want, even if everything goes bad. So I love the title of your book, and I'm glad that you unpacked that story. I think that's something that we've got to be bringing back to the forefront of society today, 2024. Let's get it back to the same awareness level that they had in the 1940s. I would love for us to once again be able to say, but if not, or
Mm,
even if, to a Christian brother, and he instantly gets the reference and knows the encouragement that we're offering him.
mm.
So, Zach, tell us some about let's talk about Built Different. Tell us a little
Yeah.
bit about that ministry you've got.
Yeah, my friend. So I appreciate the question allowing me to share. Built Different really sparked out of a podcasting platform. And that's really all it was up front. It started as a men's podcast, very similar to what you guys are doing there at Men's Alliance, where I was calling it the Battle Cry podcast, stemming out of our Ignite Men's Impact Weekend. And
Love
so
it.
I did that for really several weeks, several months. And then God placed this idea of this book on my mind where I was going to title it Built Different. And it was all going to be about how we can build and how we can champion individuals in the faith so they can be rooted, built on Christ, as Colossians 2, 6, and 7 talks about. And so that was my whole idea. I want to help people grow holistically. I wanted them to become, more athletic if they want to pursue athletics. I want them to be have physical health and wellness, the mental and emotional. Of course, that's what I get the opportunity of doing every day in counseling, the relational components, the social components, but also the spiritual growth and discipleship components. I wanted a podcast that covered and talked about all of these different core areas when we talk about human flourishing and resilience, all rooted and based in our faith. And so as I started the podcast, just titled it Built Different about 3 years ago now. It's crazy how fast time flies. And have, just like you mentioned, had the opportunity of interviewing such incredible guests just like yourself. That podcast, by the way, for all the listeners, was released very recently. So make sure it's right up there. Make sure you go back and you check it out. You spoke just such words of encouragement to men, especially leading into Father's Day, which is as of this recording as well. And so
Mhm.
just in knowing those things, being able to hear the impactful testimonies of, whether it's a big name pastor, whether it's a professional athlete, whether it's somebody that everybody knows who their name is, or it's someone that nobody knows who their name is, but their story is so impactful because it takes me back to the thought of what Paul left us with as he closed the book of Colossians. He says in Colossians 4:18, remember my chains. And I think that's such a powerful, significant imagery for me. Those three words, remember my chains, not to feel sorry for me, not to, make it seem like I'm some grand person that got out of it and escaped all of, the fiery furnaces or the chains, the prison cells myself, but that shows the transformative power of Christ, because this is who I am and that's who I used to be. God is the only one that is able to bridge that gap. And so all the testimonies that are shared on Built Different are very open, they're very authentic. We talk mental health, we talk spiritual growth and discipleship, and then we're trying to expand it more so now, just so you know, David, into more kind of training, more course-based type of stuff. We have a free online 7-day training that helps you grow in the 5 core critical areas that I kind of mentioned. It's the mental, emotional, it's the spiritual, it's the relational, it's the physical, but also it's the financial. And I want people to
Mhm.
flourish in every category of life. So we're going there, doing a lot more stuff in athletics. And then obviously it kind of intertwines with everything we have going on at Ignite, which I'm sure we'll get to as well.
Man, very, very cool. I love how you're weaving all those different, aspects of life into it. And man, that's cool that you're bringing in the financial. That's so important
Yeah.
as well. Man, that's a good one. And of course the physical. All right, next hat. Tell us
Yes.
about your Ignite ministry. For those who aren't familiar, what's that all about? And I know you're doing something big and new in it this year. Tell us about that too.
Yeah, so our Ignite Men's Impact Weekend started years and years ago when I was just a young boy. My dad had this dream and this vision that he wanted to bring men, especially men that were not church, that were not going to church. They felt beat up by the church and they felt ashamed to even show up there in the first place, David. He wanted to provide an opportunity, a ministry type of event where all men of all different races and ethnicities and backgrounds and even religions could come together to worship the same God. And so he brought this together, has pastors, had professional athletes. All of these men show up on a stage and minister and pour into the lives of not just the men, but their sons, really with me at the forefront of his mind, thinking, I want my son to see men of valor, in a sense, to see men of God for such a time as this, that he can actually look up to and try to emulate, view these guys as some of his biggest heroes in life, and help them to understand and help me to understand what living and being a man after God's own heart really looked like. And so that's what Ignite started out as. And it's just continued to grow throughout the years and blossom. I've had the wonderful opportunity of now stepping into that kind of presidential role and leader role and hosting the Ignite Men's Impact weekends. And my dad is more of that founder and overseer role. And so working alongside of my dad, first and foremost, is one of my greatest joys, especially in impacting men, because he is one of the most impactful men that I've ever known. And so just being able to serve alongside of him, what a blessing. But Ignite, as we're mentioning, plenary speakers, main stage speakers, keynote speakers that are some of your favorite athletes, to some of the biggest pastors in America, to motivational speakers. Last year we had Eric Thomas, we had Tim Tebow, we had Brian Dawkins, we had Craig Rochelle, Tim Timberlake. I mean, it was packed out. The place
Mm-hmm.
was nuts at Thomas Road, over 5,000 guys. We had a waiting list of over 2,000. The place was just in a frenzy. And it was
Yeah,
all just to have men worship God and just come
man.
to the altar broken, right, to be healed by the Lord. But also we have workshops that are all built around hunting and fishing, sports, becoming a man after God's own heart, a better husband, a better dad, all of the things that really matter to men. And so just a weekend of fun, but ultimately a weekend of faith, again, where we can grow vertically in that relationship with God and horizontally in community with one another.
Yeah, man. And I'll tell you guys, if you haven't been to an Ignite conference, and if you can get yourself to one, do it.
That's right.
It's absolutely, it's a great place to be. I've been the past 2 years in the one in Lynchburg, and
Yes.
tell us where you're going this year.
This year, we're actually going down to Grand Prairie, Texas, October 18th and 19th, coming up this fall. Going to be an absolute blast, you guys. We have another great lineup. We got Tim Tebow. We got Chad Robichow in the house. We got Garrett Unkelbach, who's a Navy SEAL down in that local area. We also have, I'm trying to think here for a second, Rick Rigsby. We got, who else we have? Daryl Strawberry. I mean, we have a
Oh,
killer
nice.
lineup. Big Daddy Weave will be in concert. It's going to be so much fun, so impactful. And I'm telling you, if you're around that local area, even if you're a couple hours away when it comes to a drive or a flight, make sure you show up, because God does something special when the boys get together. You know that, David.
Absolutely. And man, if you're listening to this and you're around anywhere near that Dallas area,
Yeah.
get yourself to the Ignite conference in October. Men's Alliance will be there.
Yes.
This month, we're actually launching our 8th tribe in
Wow.
Texas. We had 6 going into this month, launching 2 new ones there. And so I'm pumped to come out to the greater Dallas area for Ignite, but also just to connect with our tribes out there. I can't wait to, interact with our tribe leaders out there. Can't wait to see you guys, at our Ignite booth. And we're going to be working out there. We're going to be flipping some tires, and Zach's been to one of our workouts.
Absolutely.
He's been out there swinging sledgehammers with us, and man, that's just the most fun thing to do. And I'm excited to be a part of, a small part of what Ignite is doing, not only in Virginia, now in Ignite. Can't wait to see where your 3rd location is going to be, and your 4th and your 5th, but we'll be there with you. For those of you that didn't know, Zach's talking about his dad. His dad is Tim Clinton, and he's been on our podcast as well.
Nice.
And he is the author of one of my favorite books, Take It Back. So, you brought up that element about at the Ignite conference, there's a lot of fathers and sons, and that was kind of the design that your dad had was with you in mind. That's one of my favorite parts of the way you're doing men's ministry and the way we're doing men's ministry that I think is so important is you've got to make it intergenerational.
Yes.
For it to really be biblical, for it to really be impactful. You can't have a 20-something group. A guy one time asked me, this was like years ago, he was like, hey, can I start a 20s men's alliance tribe, a tribe for guys in their 20s? And I was like, no. Why would you want to do that? Why would you want to not have wisdom around your fire? So you just want a bunch of dumb 20-year-olds around the fire? It would be equally as bad to have a 40-something. You can have a bunch of dumb 40-year-olds or dumb 50-year-olds. whatever stage in life you're in, it's your first time being in that stage. So while I'm 45, that doesn't mean I have a lot of wisdom, because this is my first time ever being 45. So I've got to put myself around godly men who are older than me to get their wisdom. So,
Yes.
that's one of the things you guys are doing. And I started Men's Alliance, that very first fire we ever built 7.5 years ago. It was me and my 13-year-old son, who's now an adult in the military, married. But it was such an important part of my life with him growing up, was doing Men's Alliance, and now I'm doing it with my almost 17-year-old son, and it's all he's known as Men's Alliance. And the great thing about whether you're at Ignite or Men's Alliance is you're putting your son, guys, listen to this. You want to put your son around Christian men who are not you.
Yes.
Because men have spoken into my son's lives. They'll take him out for breakfast. They'll go for a workout together, whatever. And they'll say something to my son that I've told him 10,000 times and he never listens to. But when Thor or Chief or Sunshine says something to him, they come home and they're like, "Dad, you're not going to believe this amazing thing that I just learned." And I'm like, "Oh, that's great. Fantastic." Because there's something about just the way we're built where if your dad tells you something, you take it with a grain of salt. But if another man tells you, man, it's like a 30-pound sledgehammer. So I'm big into the way your dad built it and the way you're carrying that on. So with that, tell us a little bit about your personal story about how did you get into Christian ministry? What brought you to this point where you're full on wearing all these hats and doing Christian ministry full time?
One word comes to mind, and it's influence. My dad, he preaches that word, and he lives that word out every single day. Something that he taught me at a very young age is that influence, or that even word legacy, is not something that you leave behind for someone. It's something that you leave behind in someone. And so I've always had an unbelievable godly example and a father to look up to. I am blessed. I am privileged. I know that most of the men on here probably wouldn't be able to say that, but I am so blessed that because of the love I've received from my earthly father, I'm more capable of understanding the love of my heavenly father as well. And so I have a heart for men because I've seen the benefit of what a godly dad looked like in my own personal life. And my goal is to make sure that men are living in that same, in a sense, manner. There's an old quote by Billy Graham. He once said, "A good father is one of the most unsung, unpraised, unnoticed, and yet one of the most valuable assets in all of society." And I think you and I have talked about this even on the podcast where I was interviewing you, that I think there's a real beat down on men. So talking about specifically why I got down into the space of men's ministry is that, culture and society is trying to push this radical, toxic masculinity to feminize men, so on and so forth, just calling us buffoons, porn addicts, horrible husbands, terrible fathers, abusers. And you and I both get this, understanding the mental health side of things, understanding the spiritual health side of things. That, there's a thing called toxic behavior. We get that. People make bad choices. People make mistakes. People make bad decisions. But there's nothing toxic about being a man. If anything, Scripture reminds us, I even think of David's words to his son Solomon on his deathbed, "I'm about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong and show yourself a man." But he goes on to say, what does it look like to be a man? A man is someone who walks in obedience to the commands, to, all of the different things, the decrees that the Lord has to offer. Because when we do that, then we're leading in a way in which is actually in our rightful position. I think the greatest leaders, the greatest men that I know, David, they're difference makers because they first learned how to lead by first learning how to follow, right? You have to learn how to become a follower of God first and foremost, in my opinion, if you want to be the most effective and efficient leader within your marriage, within your home, within your family, within your workspace. And so that's my heart around ministry in general. I just want to invest into men's lives, but also I'm big on the next generation, which carries right into that same idea of influence. Some simplistic principles that I kind of teach all the time that are right on the top of my mind is that when I think of influence, it's that John Maxwell approach, that leadership is influence. Leaders, first and foremost, they understand this. Leadership is not a mood, it's a mission. what I kind of mentioned just a second ago is that it's not based on my preferences. It's not based on when I feel like it. You know, if I want to be a good dad today, if I want to be a good son, if I want to be a good brother, good husband, maybe, just maybe. No, it's understanding the purpose behind it, the mission that drives it home every single day. So I show up with my best, understanding that someone may be just dependent upon the decisions I make and the habits I create today. And that someone may very well be me. So being able to understand what it looks like to lead well, it's not a mood, it's a mission. The second one is that I don't think leaders are just problem solvers. I think leaders are
Right.
momentum makers. There's an old book that's called The Power of a Moment. It talks about how in a moment everything can
Hmm.
change, or how in a moment you can change everything. And so just helping people to recognize, if you breathe a little bit of belief in them, encouragement in them, support in them, especially the next generation, as a dad, when you're emotionally available, present, attuned to your kids, oh, it can be beneficial in their lives, not only in leading them to Christ, but also in their mental and emotional health, in their identity growth and development. So many things come into play when a dad is present, and a difference can be made. The third thing is that I believe leaders, and I'm speaking to dads here, that we should never place efficiency over intimacy. It's that old
Hmm.
quote that so many times we allow the urgent to overcrowd the important in our lives. But there was a
Hmm.
book that I read not long ago. It's titled "I'd Like You More If You Were More Like Me" by John Ortberg. And in this book, what he talks about is Jesus was not just the greatest leader to ever walk the face of the earth, but he was the greatest example of intimacy in the shared experience. He went on to say, think about what Jesus did with his disciples. They hiked together, they fished together, right? They sat around a fire together, they ate together, they prayed together, they did all of these things together. Then he went on to say, Jesus never placed efficiency over intimacy,
Right.
because he was perfectly willing to
Man,
go about doing his work more
I love John
slowly,
Ortberg.
especially when it
Oh,
meant connecting with those he loved more deeply. I love John Ortberg. He's incredible. And then the last one that I'll leave you with here too, and when we're talking about influence, is that leadership to me is not about satisfaction as much as it is about obedience, and being able to do the next best thing, to make the next right decision, to take that next best step, to stay disciplined to our roots. I think of Hebrews 12:11. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on,
right.
however, it will produce a harvest of righteousness and peace for those that have been trained by it. So recognize, I want to be an obedient man. That's what biblical masculinity looks like to me each and every day. And that's what I try to infuse within not just men, women as well, but also within our next generation, especially.
Man, I think there's so many qualities that make men great in the workplace that are detrimental to men in other areas of life.
Oh,
Like
yeah.
the thing that makes you great at your job, the thing that makes you a great CEO is the very same thing that will make you a terrible husband.
Hmm.
And so we've got to learn the men who are successful in both, the men who are successful both in work and at home are men who have the ability to transition when they get home. They can take off the work hat and put on the husband father hat.
Mm.
And it's the men that can't do that, that they're the CEO when they come home. Those are the men who are, billionaire CEOs, but they're on like their fourth marriage. Um, they're CEO all the time. And one of those qualities that makes us great at work and is horrific elsewhere is efficiency. Like you
Yes.
said, it's efficiency because I think every guy, we love things that are efficient,
Mm.
right? We love processes, procedures, engines, mechanisms that are efficient. But when it comes to relationships, efficiency is an awful idea, right? And
It
a lot
is.
of guys approach conversations with their kids or wives with that efficiency mindset. And guys, you got to take that hat off and hang that up when you walk in the door.
Mm.
And one of the things I talk about is the phrase, why don't we just? Because
Mm.
when somebody says, why don't we just, whatever they're about to say, it's designed at making things more efficient. When you hear the word
Right.
just, they're about to make things more efficient. They're about to tell you a shortcut or an easier way to do the thing you're doing. But it's also going to destroy the kind of the environment or the vibe that the thing created in the first place.
Yes.
Right. So it's like, you know, if you were going to, like, I don't know, just an example off the top of my head, like if you're going to take your 13-year-old daughter out on a date, um, you know, somebody, and you're going to get dressed up and you're going to go to a nice restaurant because you're going to start teaching her how a man needs to treat her and what she should expect from a man. Somebody could come in there with the efficiency mindset and be like, why don't you just, you know, make her grilled cheese at home? Why don't you just go to McDonald's? That's more efficient. Yep, that is absolutely more efficient, and it's absolutely going to destroy this evening if we go for efficiency. So that's just one of those many things that make us great in the workplace that'll hurt us at home. And I'm so glad to hear you bring that up, because that's something that you don't hear people talk about a lot when it comes to leadership. Is the leader is the one that has to recognize, when do we need efficiency?
Yeah.
And when do we need to slow down and be inefficient? Because it's about the person, it's about the relationship. It's not about the minutes saved or the dollars saved. We can save all the minutes and dollars and destroy a lot of relationships because we've got efficiency as our primary goal. One of the other things that I wanted to jump to here with you is there's so many problems going on, right?
Yeah.
You've already named several of them. So many problems going on in our culture. We could talk about with men, we could talk about with Christians, we could talk about with Christian men. There's so many problems going on. Which one are you kind of like the most passionate about addressing? Like, which problem is attractive to you? You're like, I love that problem and I want to go after that one. Which problem going on in our culture do you feel drawn to help solve?
You know, I think I was just talking about this with my dad not too long ago about especially what are men up against in culture and society. And we wrote down these 4 P's. It was the first one I'll unpack for you is pressure, right? Men have a lot of pressure on them. Pressure to perform, pressure to protect, pressure to provide. And they get beat down quite a bit, you know, make them feel almost as if they're not doing a good enough job. And so my goal is to shift that perspective a little bit and to help men understand, again, just how significant they are for such a time as this, how impactful their influence and their leadership can be in their kids' lives. That's not putting more pressure on them. In my sense, it's relieving them of the pressure to recognize all they need to do, in a sense, is replace the pressure with their presence, right? I want men just to be able to show up and be more present in the lives of their kids, because when I do the research and I do the statistics, when I work with kids, I tell you this, David, I would say 100% of the kids that I work with, I'll say this, 100% of the individuals that I work with in counseling sessions, guess what? They have a father wound of some way, shape, or form. That's mind-blowing to me. And so when we even think about the significance of a dad and his presence in the lives of his children, all the way up to the 60, 70, 80-year-old men that I've worked with that are coming to me because there's a father wound there that was never truly resolved. Man, it just shows you how impactful that leadership is. So the first one, again, is pressure. The second one is their phones. Men are so preoccupied, as you mentioned, where we're constantly on our phones. It's not just our kids. Parents are really good at, in a sense, instructing kids instead of investing into their kids. And so my thing with their phones is, I remember sitting at a game. I was at a soccer game, a 5 and 6-year-old soccer game. That can be tough to watch, David. Let me tell you that first and foremost. My niece,
it's painful, man.
it can be painful, right? Especially as a competitor. You're like, come on, let's score. But I'm at my niece's soccer game. She's 5 years old. Love Olivia to death. And she's out there. And I'll never forget, there was a little girl on the other team that I must have been sitting right next to her dad. And she kept saying, Dad, look up at me. Look at me, just wanting his attention. And I'm thinking to myself, how preoccupied we are that we can't even give our undivided attention. When my wife and I, Evelyn and I, first got married, I was taking ministry home with me quite a bit. You talked about like efficiency. And I was taking phone calls late into the night because I'll be honest with you, I'm like a fixer. I'm a helper. I want to help everybody. But I was neglecting my Jerusalem, my wife, my marriage, to try to reach, in a sense, the Judeas and the Samarias and the uttermost parts of this earth. I was taking the phone calls. And I'll never forget, my wife looked at me and said, Zach, listen, like, I don't know. I can't do this. You know what I mean? You're going to have to put the phone away eventually, because I just want, in a sense, I want your time. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm giving you my time, right? We sit down together on the couch. We're watching, our shows together. We're eating dinner. But what she was saying, again, it goes back to it wasn't time as much as it was my undivided attention. Put the phone away, dad. Put the phone
Yeah.
away, husband, and actually be able to relate to your kids and to your wives. The third one is pornography.
Mm.
Pornography is rampant across our culture and society today. Pornography is something that I can't even begin to tell you the statistic of the men, especially the young boys, that are struggling with it. And I think it goes back to there's so many different A's, right? It's easily accessible. You find it everywhere. It's easily affordable. It's free. I think it's the, in a sense, drug of choice for the church because it allows you to remain anonymous.
Yeah.
It is continuing to accelerate. It now has, this AI garbage attached to it, and ultimately it can become incredibly addicting. And so, if there are any men out there that are struggling with pornography, something that I always try to just invest into your life. That was a battle for me growing up as a kid. I want men to understand this. You cannot heal in hiding. If you're trying to battle that
That's
addiction
right.
on your own by yourself, I promise you're setting yourself up for failure 10 out of 10 times. But when you begin to turn away from sin, right? You don't fight it head on. I think that's the only real sin in scripture that it says. It doesn't say to fight, it says to flee. Get away
Mhm.
from it. Like Joseph ran from Potiphar's wife. Turn your attention and your gaze somewhere else and get help now. It's okay to ask for help. We live in a culture and society, I think, that for some reason has equated brokenness with humiliation or embarrassment. A lot of men live in hiding, live in shame, live in this sense of hiddenness. Man, you have to find, in a sense, friends for the fire. You have to be able to feel things and reveal things in order to heal the things in your life. And then the last one is people. I can't tell you how many men I have been around that have told me, man, Zach, if only I wouldn't have got in with the wrong crowd, right?
Yeah.
Especially young boys. You know what? I got in with the wrong crowd. I got into some trouble. I made some bad decisions. It just shows you, again, the power of influence, who you surround yourself with. One of my favorite animals to study and always to like watch Wild Kingdom episodes with my dad about was that of the lion. The
Yep.
lion has a mindset that is so fierce, so ferocious, it's so unique. Whenever a lion steps into a certain situation, it thinks one thing, kill. And no matter what is in a lion's way, it thinks one thing, run, right? Get out of there because the lion is so fierce. And I always thought to myself, why are lions, how do they have such a tenacity about them and that mindset about them? Because they run in packs. If you know that a lion pack is called a pride. What I always try to remind men, especially young kids, is that a lot of people don't take pride internally in the pride they surround themselves with externally. We seek community, right, for comfort and validation rather than for teaching and correction. And as Proverbs 27:17 talks about, as iron sharpens iron, so one man should sharpen another. My prayer is that people would recognize that there's a difference between your boys, right, the guys that you're partying with, the guys you're drinking alcohol with that don't really even care about you. They don't care about your well-being. They don't care about your future. There's a difference between those boys and your brothers, the ones that Proverbs 17:17 talks about. Friends love at all times, but a brother is born for times of adversity. So I want to remind people, don't just surround yourself with people, surround yourself with the right people, those that not only support you, but also those that sharpen you and take you places within yourself that you couldn't go by yourself. So again, pressure, phones, pornography, and people. Those are kind of the big four issues that I think men especially are struggling with in culture and society today.
Man, those are so powerful. Every one of them, man. We could do a podcast on each one.
Yeah.
Um, you know, to you're talking about the pornography and the addiction, whatever it is men are struggling with. And some of the big ones that I think about that I've heard guys sharing and talking about around the fire have certainly been addictions, but
Yeah.
also just men who are going through either a separation or a divorce, men
Mhm.
whose like wife is in the process of leaving them and maybe taking
Mhm.
kids. Also, I would kind of categorize with that men who have just been laid off or fired from a job. Those things can feel to men shameful. Like
Mhm.
like to say that you lost your job or your wife's left you, those things can sound like failures, like I've messed up. And so because of that, men don't want to talk about it. Those are just like we could just make a whole list of things guys don't want to admit they're going through. They don't want to admit they're struggling with alcohol or pornography or their wife left them or their boss
Mhm.
fired them. But every single one of those things, when you keep them inside, when you don't
Yes.
talk about them, every single one of those things grows and
Yes,
just
it does.
becomes like bigger and uglier. And we feel like it's just this nasty, all consuming thing that we're the only ones in the world struggling with.
Mm,
And then what I've seen so many times is when the guy says it out loud, when he speaks it out loud around the fire, it begins to diminish that thing's power over him. And there's
mm,
just something about sharing it. You know, we say all the time, isolation is terminal in
yes.
Men's Alliance. And, you know, I think secrecy and lies, and they both kind of go hand in hand. Secrecy and lies are the addiction. I mean, they're the fertilizer that addiction grows in,
Come on.
right? And so when we keep things in the dark, they just grow. And when we
Yes.
bring them out and we put them in that light by the fire, share them with other men, as hard as that can be, the first time when you say it out loud, man, that's the moment that things turn around in most guys' lives. That's the moment
Mm,
where they get on a different course. And guys, I'll tell you, whatever it is you're struggling with, you don't have to struggle alone with it.
mm,
Bring it to other men, put it out there, bring it to God, speak it out loud, stop hiding it. Hiding it is actually what Satan wants you to do with it, because as long as you're hiding it, he can keep you convinced that you're the only one dealing with it, that you're worse
yes.
than everybody, that you're terminally unique, right? But you're not. Everybody's got the same
Mm,
problems. And
that's
as long
right.
as he can kind of keep us all in our own little cubicles thinking that we're worse than everybody else, that's how he wins. But when we all get together and are open and honest and real,
Mm,
that's where kind of all this good stuff begins to happen. That's the U-turn moment. So with
mm.
those P's that you just hit on, Zach, um, how do you solve that? What's the best move for fixing those problems of the phone and the pornography, the people and the pressure?
All of those things, just like you touched on, David, so eloquently, is this idea that they lead to shame in my mind.
Mm.
And like you talked about loneliness. Loneliness to me is the invisible illness of our day and age. And something that I always try to say is that it's the undiagnosed diseases that are always the most dangerous and deadly, right? So we have to recognize the impact that loneliness is having, not just on individuals emotionally and, mentally and spiritually, but I also think of the physical components. There was a big research study that just came out that said that loneliness can have the same effect on the human body that smoking 15 to 16 cigarettes a day can have. That's mind
Holy
boggling to me.
smokes.
That's mind boggling. So, loneliness is literally killing people in culture
Mm-hmm.
and society today. And I think when we recognize that isolation is the enemy, not just of our faith, but of growth and progress in general, we'll begin to recognize the counter to that. When shame says, if you really knew me, then you wouldn't like me or you wouldn't accept me, and pushes us into that sense of hiddenness, that friendship and community says, no, 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 we know everything about you, right? We welcome that. We want you to be open, to be real, to be raw, to be rugged, as your motto would say, to be vulnerable with one another. One of the greatest tools and assets I've used in the counseling and therapeutic process is self-disclosure, where I'm able to be vulnerable, especially with kids, because kids typically come into sessions and they don't want to be here, David, right? They got dropped off by their mom or their
Yeah.
dad. They didn't drive themselves to counseling, right? But
Right.
what I try to do is I try to make it such a unique opportunity and experience for kids that they can't wait to get back, because I just want real, vulnerable conversations. Vulnerability breeds and sparks vulnerability. The
Yeah, it
more
does.
open you are to other people, guess what? They begin to tear down their own walls, their own barriers. And rather than holding you at arm's length and distance, they begin to allow you into the midst of their mess. And that's the beautiful thing about God, is that he doesn't require perfection. He just asks for your heart. He just asks for an openness and a willingness and a posture of your heart that would say, you know what, God, you may know my sin, but you still call me by my name.
That's good. Man, Men, are you looking to buy a new home? Maybe it's a vacation home, maybe a rental property, or maybe it's building your dream home, and you need a mortgage. Well, I want to tell you about a tribesman who can help you with just that. Chris Norwood, call sign Coop from Hammer Tribe. He works at Towne Bank Mortgage. He has been doing this for over 21 years. He's qualified to lend in 16 states. He can definitely help you out. Let me give you his contact info. You can go to townbankmortgage.com/Chris Norwood, or you can call him directly at 804-439-3206. Again, this is Chris Norwood, call sign Coop. He's a Men's Alliance guy from Towne Bank Mortgage who can help get you a loan for your dream home. He even helped Iron buy his new house. Check him out. If you had to pick like one message to broadcast on like every billboard and every website to American men, what do you think would be that most important message that you would love to drive into the heart of every American man?
I was reading a book recently called Meant for Good by Megan Fate Marshman. And she's a woman that we had speak at our most recent Next Gen conference, a conference on youth mental health that was down in Atlanta, Georgia. And that Meant for Good sparks from a promise, which is Romans 8:28. A lot of us know it. A lot of us kind of view it as almost a promise of prosperity, that things are going to go really well. For we know that all things work together for the good of those who love God and who have been called according to his purpose. The problem, though, is that a lot of people view that verse in I think, a misproper or an improper context, where it's like, you know what? Because I love God, that means everything's going to work out in my favor.
Mm-hmm.
And we have an improper definition of what good really means. Some of us maybe haven't actually surrendered our thing over to God to allow him to utilize those things and turn it into something good. We haven't fully given up our grief. We haven't fully given up our addiction. We haven't fully given up our anxiety or our depression or our broken marriage or our wayward child. We haven't given up all these things because although we know the good news of the gospel and we proclaim it every day, we just aren't sure if God's really going to show up in our own personal lives. And so we try to take the job of God out of his hands rather than trusting him. We try to toughen up and we try to do it on our own and white knuckle our way through life. But I want men especially to realize that their power can only be found through surrender. And then the improper definition of good is that a lot of us, when we think of good, because I love God, things will be good for me. We think of easy and comfortable and convenient and successful and favorable in my own terms, in my own definitions, in my own ways. But it's amazing what God actually does. He defines his definition of good for us in the very next verse in Romans 8:29, where we don't even get to because we're just relying on the promise of prosperity, where he says, "For those he foreknew, he also predestined that they would be conformed to the image of his son." And so I'm thinking back to James 1, right? 2-4. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith goes on to produce perseverance. So let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature, complete, lacking nothing. We don't consider it joy when times aren't good, in terms of we don't consider it joy in the midst of the trial or in the midst of the suffering in our seasons of life. But we can consider it joy because God can use those things and can produce something better in the midst of them. What Satan meant for evil, God meant for good, right? He is the great repurposer, the restorer, the redeemer that can take something that Satan maybe used to destroy you and he can use it instead to strengthen and develop you. That's the message of hope in my mind for every man out there listening, because we recognize then this: hope is never lost because hope is a person and hope has a name, and that name is Jesus.
Man, roll credits. We're done. That was awesome, man. You know, I think there's a lot of great theology in that, but there's also a lot of great leadership in that, because that's kind of what a leader is too. A leader is the person who never loses hope.
Yeah.
Who never throws in the towel, who, no matter how, you know, down they might look and how bad the odds are against them, the leader is the one who says there's still a chance here.
Yeah.
And who can find the good in anything. And, you know, like you were talking about James 1, we're actually supposed to celebrate when we're going through trials, knowing that this is going to bring about us. This is sharpening, right? And we talk about iron sharpening iron. Well, you don't have iron get sharpened gently.
Yes.
Iron gets, we all love, you know, it's right here on our logo, 27:17.
Yep.
We all love that verse, but the truth is iron gets sharpened with sparks flying, right?
Exactly.
It's a sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes painful process of trials that we're
Mm,
going through. And I think that the key to getting through a trial is recognizing that you're in a trial, first of
mhm.
all, and knowing how you want to come out of it. And I always think, I want to get it right. I want to learn whatever the lesson God's teaching me from this trial. I want to learn it and get it right so I don't go through it again. I don't
Right.
want God to have to keep, trying to teach me this a dozen times because I never figure it out. I want to recognize, okay, man, this is a trial. What's God trying to teach me here? God, what are you saying to me? And how do I want to come out the other end of this so that I don't have to keep going through this? But like you're saying, that attitude of good, that's how we need to view even the rough times. And I like what you said. Maybe our definition of good is askew, and that's the thing that needs to change. Now, you might have just answered this question. I don't know. You might have already answered my next question, but I wanted to ask you, what is one of the most impactful books that you've read recently? Give us one of your best book recommendations.
Yeah. Besides that book that I just recently read, Meant for Good by Megan Fate Marshman, I would even add I'm currently working through No More Excuses by
Oh yeah.
Dr. Tony Evans, right? An incredible book for men. I've read it before, but I'm reading it again because it goes back to that concept of I don't want to place my preferences over God's principles and God's promises in my life. Too often, I think we allow our problems to override his promises. We're in the midst of tough times, we're in the midst of hardship, we're in the midst of suffering, and that's all we can think about. But we can't look back and we can't remember all the times that God has shown up for us in the past, and we certainly get so afraid that He's not going to, repeat Himself in the future. And so it's being able to remind ourselves, let's no more excuses. Let's stay disciplined to ourselves. And I believe this, that discipline trumps desire. But discipline also fuels desire. The more you do something, it's the power of one. The more you do something, the more you'll do something. There's that old country song, the more I drink, the more I drink, right? So being able to recognize that's it though. If I can do something today and I can make a
Yeah.
choice today, what you feed grows. So if I'm feeding my fear, I'm just going to grow more afraid. If I'm feeding my faith, I'm going to continue to expound upon what it looks like to develop an even if faith or a built different faith. All of these things that matter most. So for men out there, you know what? You got to balance grace and grit. Yeah, you know what? You may not be perfect, and that's okay, but give yourself grace and compassion, but get back up, dust off, and keep moving forward. That's the Galatians 6:9, right? Do not grow weary in doing what is right, for in due time you will reap a harvest if you do not give up. So balance grace, but you better bring a lot of grit to the table. No More Excuses by Dr. Tony Evans.
Man, I love that you mentioned no more excuses. Um, if you're listening to this and you haven't read that, you gotta read No More Excuses.
Yeah.
Um, it's been around a long time.
Yep.
One of the best things that my parents did that I copied when I was raising my kids is my parents, they paid me to read books. I was not a I was not a big reader in high school, and they started paying me, but they picked the books. So they would be like, this is a $25 book, this is a $50 book. They rewarded, and I've talked about this a lot, they rewarded the things that they wanted me to do. They
Mm.
didn't pay me to mow, they didn't pay me to, take out the trash or eat my broccoli. They paid me, and that was one of the very first books that I can remember them paying me to read was No More Excuses,
I love it.
and that was a life changer. That was a game changer, and it put me on a different trajectory. And making excuses is something that
Mm.
men do. First of all, nobody wants to make excuses. You can't find anybody that says, I want to make excuses. I
Right.
disagree with the book. I'd like to make excuses.
Right.
Everybody thinks they're not making excuses, but they do it like reflexively.
Hmm.
They're just saying stuff and they don't even realize, dude, you're making excuses. You have to like point it out to a person for them to realize it because we do it without realizing that we're doing it. And I think that's one of the things that the book helped with
Yeah.
is realizing like you just made an excuse. I remember in the book he talks about the loser's limp,
Yep.
and like you don't realize like that's a way of making an excuse. Like he's talking
Yes.
about, like when the guy dives and he misses the catch in the end zone. and he gets up and he limps,
Mm,
like he's
mm,
kind of saying the reason I missed is because I'm injured and hurt. He's
right.
making an excuse without you even realizing it. And you know, Tony
And not
Evans is like,
accepting responsibility.
that's exactly right. He's like, no more losers limp.
Yep.
And man, so such a great book. All right. Last question. And you're the first guy that I'm asking this to on the podcast. And it's a question I want to start asking more guests. What is your currently, because I get that this changes with seasons
Yeah.
of life, but currently, what's your favorite book of the Bible that
Mm.
is drawing you into it? It's pulling you, like you feel like this is what I want to be reading this.
I've been working my way through the Gospels, and I would naturally say my favorite Gospel to read through right now is the book of John. But currently, I am reading through the book of Mark. And Mark is continuing to just draw me in time and time again because I love, as you read through the Gospels, the unique parables, the unique stories, the unique accounts that these different real world perspectives have on the life of Christ. And one in particular story was Mark chapter 4, and it's verses 35 to 42, 7 short verses. And it's the account of Jesus and the disciples when they get on the boat and they get caught up in the midst of this massive storm swell. And Jesus is, he's down in the bottom of the boat. And what's he doing? He's sound asleep, right? He's fast asleep on a cushion. In
Hmm.
other words, he had planned to be there. And all of the disciples are like, what in the world? Like, let's get Jesus up out of the stern of the boat. Let's wake him up. And so when they wake him up, they probably are shaking him like, dude, we're about to die, right? The waves are so big, they're about to get sunk. And they say, teacher, do you not care that we're about to drown? Like, are you kidding me? And I can see Jesus probably just waking up and he comes out and he says, quiet and be still. And the storm stops entirely. It becomes calm again. But then he looks at his disciples and he said, why are you so afraid? And why do you have such little faith? And the disciples begin to look at each other and they begin to question, who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? But I thought about the question that Jesus asked. And I thought to myself, like, why would he ask that question? Clearly, he already knew the answer. We know that. Every time Jesus asked the question, he already knew the answer, but he wanted to get to know these men more intimately. But he asked them this question, why are you so afraid? Well, I don't know, Jesus. Probably because the wind and the waves were so big that we were about to die, right? It's an easy answer here. But then I think back, and why he asked that question was because in verse 35 of Mark chapter 4, Jesus had already given them a promise. And the promise was that together they were going to make it to the other side. Now, he never promised what the journey was going to look like on the way. He never promised smooth sailing. He never promised clear skies. He never promised there wouldn't be a storm. He never promised there wouldn't be waves. Never promised there wouldn't be fear. But what he promised was his presence every step of the way. And that's that idea of not only does God offer us saving grace in this life through the gift of salvation for those that believe and receive the forgiveness for their sins, then they can become a child of God. But also, he offers what they call sustaining grace, where he never promises the absence of pain in this life, but he always promises his presence in the midst of our pain. And I believe this when you begin to recognize and you begin to draw near to God, especially in the midst of your stormy seasons, and you hit rock bottom and realize He's the only rock at the bottom, when you realize that God never promises security from the fire, but He promises security in the fire, that's where your life, I really do believe, will begin to change. It will be transformed, and you'll start to realize that with Christ at the helm of your ship, not only will you be safe, but you can weather any storm. So I would definitely say the book of Mark has been pretty transformative in my life.
Man, so good, Zach. So good, man. That was a message right there. That'll preach, brother. Mark is often overlooked, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah.
You hear everybody preaching from John and Matthew, and then at Christmas Luke,
Yep.
and Mark gets overlooked. Mark was the first biography of Jesus published,
Mm.
you know, and it's the shortest one. So
Come on.
as men, we ought to love the book of Mark.
That's right.
He wrote it first, and he wrote it shortest. It's like the AP News bulletin release about Jesus's life, death, and resurrection, and it really combats the notion out there that says the deity of Jesus was a later invention.
Mm,
that came about years later in John's biography and in Paul's letters. No, it's in the deity of Jesus is in the very first gospel written. The deity of Jesus is found in Mark. It's not a later invention. It's right there in Mark when
that's right.
Jesus is being questioned by the high priest,
Mm,
and the high priest asked Jesus, "Are you the Messiah? Are you the Son of Man?" And Jesus says, "I am."
mm,
And they rip their robes and say, "What more do you need? This man's guilty of blasphemy. Let's execute him." Right there you go. Jesus being killed for blasphemy, claiming to
mm,
be God in Mark. That's why I love Mark.
mm.
And it's such an important thing to go back and reread these things
Yeah.
because they're living. The word of God is living, and you've changed every day. I've changed every day. So
Yeah.
whenever it is you last read it, if you're thinking to yourself, I already read Mark, well, you're not the same person you were.
Exactly.
So it's gonna hit you different. You're gonna see it different. There's gonna be something new every single time. So I think it's awesome that you
Mm,
highlighted for us, Mark. So men, check out these books. We're going to put No More Excuses in the
yeah.
show notes. We're going to put Even If in the show notes. Go read Mark. I don't think we can link. Oh, sure, we can. We can link Mark in the show notes, Bible Gateway or something like that.
That's right.
Um, check it out. And also, I just want to say you can go to zachclinton.com.
Mm,
Go to zachclinton.com if you want to see more about his different ministries, Built Different, Ignite, his books, his speaking, his counseling, all these things that Zach's
mm,
doing. One of the reasons why we love partnering with you, Zach, is because you're real,
mm,
you're authentic, and that comes through
mm.
when you speak. That just, it emanates from you that you're pointing men to something that you've discovered
Mm,
personally, and it's life changing for you. And I feel like that's something that you and I have in common is we're both just beggars showing other men where we found the bread. So thanks for what you're doing, brother. Look forward to seeing you next, which will probably be in Dallas.
yes.
And we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. And guys, remember, when you're in a trial, when you're going through something terrible, like Zach said, lean into God,
Yeah.
right? Rely on God, surrender to God. Don't try to steer by yourself.
Mm,
I failed at trying it. I
I did too.
crashed into the rocks. Zach's crashed into the rocks. And it's that pride thing that tells us, oh, I can get out of this. I can fix it. You can't. None of us can.
Mm,
The reason why we go through trials is to bring us closer to God. So we surrender, so we put him in charge, let him steer. And honestly, that's where life really begins too.
yeah. That's
Life
exactly right.
begins when you give the controls over to God. And I'll tell you from my experience too, that's where it gets more fun.
Yeah.
That's where it gets more adventurous. The
Yes.
Christian life is the most fun, the most exciting, the most adventurous, and it's the most peaceful, joyful, and rewarding. So, man, whatever it is you're going through, the answer is literally God. It always
Mm,
is, and it always has been. So, Zach, I want to give you the last words, brother. Hit
man,
it, hit us with some Zach Clinton.
Goose, let me tell you, my friend, I would just echo what you said, right? That God loved you so much that he sent his one and only son to live a perfect and blameless and sinless life, to be the atonement for our sins, to die a substitutionary death in your place on a rugged Roman cross, to then 3 days later rise again, defeating sin, defeating death, so that you would have the opportunity of spending eternal life with him. And it really is as simplistic as believing that God is who he says he is, and then asking and receiving the grace and the forgiveness of your sins, so that way we can become a child, a son of the Most High God. That really does reiterate and drive home that point that hope can never be lost. Sometimes it just needs to be redirected because, again, hope is a person and hope has a name. and that name is Jesus. Goose, my friend, I cannot thank you enough for the opportunity. Dude, you're a blessing. We couldn't do what we do at Ignite without strategic and incredible partners such as Men's Alliance. Thank you for equipping and activating men all over the country and the world to be able to step into and become the man that God has destined and called them to become. So, my friend, we love you. We all appreciate you from our hearts to yours. Thank you for having me on today.
All right. Thanks, Zach. To find out more about what we're doing and to join us on our mission, go to men'salliancetribe.com. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and give us a 5-star review.